kind of an internet social media sensation that's been going around. If you're on social media, perhaps you have seen it, or maybe even participated in it. But it's people using cultural references, remembrance of old places, to date themselves and to say, I am this many years old. So people using historical artifacts, places in the city, remembering when the Red Road was a violent corridor, and people would come down, especially on a day like today, on Mother's Day. Not only were churches be filled, but there were restaurants on Reading Road that people would go to and eat. Remembering other times and events that happened as a way of celebrating their age and their marker. And one of the things, my brothers and sisters, that I would say is I remember going to the movie theater to watch a movie called Soul Food. And before it was a show on Showtime, when the movie first came out with Vanessa Williams, Miss America Vanessa Williams, not the other Vanessa Williams who played in the show, with Nia Long, Soul Food, yeah, that's the movie. And they were in this movie, and the movie centered around a character that everyone called Big Mama. Everyone would come to Big Mama's house on Sundays to eat Sunday dinner. And throughout the movie, my brothers and sisters, as they came together, they would eat dinner, and we saw some of the goings on of the house that at the beginning of the movie, the family looked so wonderful and perfect. At the beginning of the movie, you get to see, as we get a closer look at them, the ways that the family is actually falling apart. And then eventually Big Mama gets sick and eventually dies in the movie. And the family wonders if they're going to be able to carry on throughout it. But it all centers around the table, around them eating together. Because that is one of the things that we celebrate about mothers, is their providing, their ability in nature as a provider, my brothers and sisters. Now, I want to just be clear about a couple of things. Number one is that regardless of what society says and the way that society tries to dictate what motherhood should look like, there is no right way to do motherhood. That God calls mothers into this role to be themselves in this role and not to look like or act like anybody else. That you cannot live up to anybody else's image or standard of what motherhood is or supposed to be, and you're not supposed to. That God called you to be you. And if there's one thing that we believe, my brothers and sisters, just the same way that your relationship with God has to be your own, you can't have a relationship with God that's based on anybody else and how they relate to God. Just as even though we are so glad and grateful for and look to and lean on the prayers of others, that others' prayer life does not substitute for our prayer life, that we hope and believe and try to encourage everyone to cultivate their own life of prayer. And so, which is why we spend time in service, either individually and sometimes communally, gathering in prayer, because we hope that you are taking time to cultivate your own prayer life with God and not just looking to clergy or other established leadership to pray for you. Just as, my brothers and sisters, your salvation, your relationship with God, your prayer life have to be cultivated between you and God. So, and each of those has its own dynamic. Your relationship with God cannot look like my relationship with God because you are not me. And the way I relate to God is individual. It is the way that God has created me. In the way that you relate to God is based on how God has created you, my brothers and sisters. And as long as we are doing it earnestly with our best selves, bringing our best selves into that relationship, that is all that God asks brothers and sisters. In the same way, the same thing is true for motherhood, that God does not call us to be or to imagine motherhood as one specific way. There is not one way to do motherhood, and any time that we begin to fall into that notion, we're going down a slippery slope, my brothers and sisters, because then we discount who God has created us to be. And I want you to know that for each of you who are mothers in this place, or each of you who are yearning to be mothers in this place, or for each of you who play mother roles in someone else's children's lives, my brothers and sisters, that God has gifted you in a particular way to fill that role, to sit in that seat. God does not call you to be anybody else, but God called you with the gifts that you have and the strengths that you have, and the wonderfulness that God has placed inside of you to bring that out and to trust that that is enough, my brothers and sisters. I can't stress that enough, because it is so easy for us to look at ourselves in comparison to other people and feel that we fall short. But there is a proverb that comes from one of the great many tribes that exist in the beautiful continent of Africa. The proverb says that if the gazelle always compares itself to the lion, the gazelle never will understand its own genius. But God has gifted us each individually with our own gifts and genius, my brothers and sisters. And so to every mother in the place, I want you to know that God has gifted you with your own gifts and genius around motherhood, and you don't have to depend on or look to or be like or replicate anybody else, but just be yourself and trust that being yourself with God's help is all that it takes. My brothers and sisters, won't you do me a favor? Won't you help me in this? Because I'm so far away from all of you wonderful mothers out there, but some of you are closer than I am. So won't you look and find a mother, a grandmother, a godmother, an auntie next to you, and just touch them on the shoulder and let them know that God has gifted you. Let them know God has gifted you. And you are enough. In fact, you are more than enough all by yourself. Now, I don't know why y'all shy on this Mother's Day, but I want you to encourage somebody today with your best Sunday morning encouraging voice and let them know that God has gifted you and you are more than enough.
God has gifted you and you are more than enough. Yes. God has gifted you.
You don't have to be like anybody else. You don't have to look to anybody else. You don't have to try to imitate anybody else. All you have to do is be yourself, my brothers and sisters, and trust that God is going to equip you, that God has given you all that you need, and being yourself is enough. In fact, this is one of the hidden lessons of the story of the widow of Zarephath, my brothers and sisters, is that when the prophet comes to the widow, the prophet doesn't bring anything to the widow. The prophet helps this widow to understand that what she has, even though she thinks it's not enough, even though it looks like it's not enough, even though when she measures it to what seems like is going to be necessary to withstand the storm that has arisen in the community, my brothers and sisters, that what we see end up happening is that what she has, the seemingly little bit that she has, is more than enough to sustain her and her family throughout the time. And if that is true for the widow of Zarephath, surely it is true for each and every one of us, that God has equipped us, has strengthened us, has given us all that we need. And we don't have to look outside for something to add to it, but just in what God has given us and equipped us with. God has birthed us. God said to the prophet Jeremiah, don't you know that I knew who you were before you had a name. I knew who you were before anybody saw your face. I knew who you were, God said, when you're in your mother's womb. And at that point in time, I had called you to be a prophet to the nations. God knew who you were before you ever stepped foot on this earth, my brothers and sisters. And what we are learning now, what science is teaching us now, which is just a confirmation of the goodness and the wisdom of God that we have believed by faith through generations. What science is teaching us is that even in our mother's womb, that the lessons, the wisdom that DNA is able, it transfers into us from going back 2 and 3 generations. And so that all of the DNA we have exists when we are in our mother's womb, and it actually exists when our mother was in her mother's womb, and actually existed when our mother's mother was in her mother's womb, my brothers and sisters, so that you carry inside of you the wisdom of the DNA of generations, so that when your mother's mother was born, God was already making preparations for you, so that all you needed was already in existence long before you came on this earth. When you stepped into the world, my brothers and sisters, you already carried the wisdom of generations, because God has been preparing for you in this moment. You are more than enough. So, my brothers and sisters, here in this biblical text, we see a widow who is trying to make provisions, and not like soul food, my brothers and sisters. She is not trying to make a wonderful meal of ham and turkey, macaroni and cheese, sweet potatoes, collard greens, and cornbread, my brothers and sisters. But she is just trying to make a little bit of cornbread, and not even real rich cornbread, what my mother used to call hot water cornbread, and just make a little bit of hot water cornbread because that is all that she has in the house. And she is trying to make this last little struggle meal for her and her son because the economic times have been tough. Now, I know some people would say, my brothers and sisters, there are some people who look at this widow in this situation and would say, how can she be such a bad judge of resources? How can she be so wasteful to come to the place where she has nothing but this last little meal? How could she be so irresponsible when she has a child to have run out of food? My brothers and sisters, but those people hadn't read their Bibles, because if you read to the beginning of the chapter, and start at the beginning of the chapter, you would see that this woman's economic condition, her situation, the fact that she is in this place of poverty is not because of anything that she has done, but because of the failures of the structure of society that has happened around her, my brothers and sisters. In fact, it has been so bad, what has happened in the world is so bad that God called Elijah, who was a tradesman, God called Elijah to come and leave his work of being a tradesman to take on this mantle of prophet, to speak to King Ahab and Queen Jezebel about how the evil that they are perpetuating in society is impacting people, and God is not pleased with what is happening. God says to Elijah to go tell Ahab and Jezebel that the laws that they are passing, that the tax cuts that they are giving to the wealthiest of Israelites, while other people are forced to suffer. The fact that they are trying to roll back health care for people who need it most, while others are enjoying taxpayer-funded health care. That the fact that they are trying to, that they are using American tax money to enrich themselves and enrich oligarchs, both domestic and abroad, to make sure that the richest of people enjoy subsidies on behalf of taxpayers. Meanwhile, the infrastructure that are supposed to be caring for those who are considered the least of these, the most vulnerable of these, are falling apart. Elijah, go tell King Ahab that what he is doing is not pleasing in the eyes of God. Because all the other people in government seem unable or ill-equipped to do it. So Elijah, go tell King Ahab and Queen Jezebel that what they are doing is not pleasing in the eyes of God, and that no matter how many times they sing God bless Israel, no matter how many times they put their hands over their heart, no matter how many times they try to gather together and invoke my name as they continue to perpetuate this mess, that I will have no part of it. And I will not bless the land while they continue to abuse those who are the most vulnerable. And Elijah goes and he does it. He goes and he tells King Ahab and Queen Jezebel that until God says so, it will not rain. Unless you turn from the way that it is going, unless you move how you are running the government, unless you get in line with what God has designed and dictated to make sure that everybody has food to eat, to make sure that everybody's needs are taken care of, to make sure that there is a safety net in Israel for all of God's people. Until you do what God has designed, that I'm going to stop the rain. Elijah leaves. Ahab and Jezebel are mad, but it does not rain. It doesn't rain, my brothers and sisters. And the king and the queen had their own prophets, their own soothsayers, their own religious people, their own pastors on call that they called to have meetings to come and to flatter them and to speak well of them. But no matter how many times they gathered together to speak well of the king, my brothers and sisters, they could not make it rain. And so, in the midst of this, my brothers and sisters, God sends the prophet Elijah to a nice riverside spa. And there, as the prophet Elijah is enjoying life in seclusion on this riverside spa, God has the first form of Uber Eats, my brothers and sisters. But it's not a driver, it's air-mailed in, my brothers and sisters. But it's not an Amazon drone that flies it in, it's a raven that flies in food every day. So Elijah has this wonderful life, living by the river, having an abundant flow of water at a time when there is a drought, my brothers and sisters, having food flown into him by God's ravens every day. And it's a wonderful life that is happening. But, my brothers and sisters, the lack of rain upon the land causes the river to dry up. There is a natural progression to these things, my brothers and sisters, that the injustice that begins at the palace creates a natural disaster for the nation. And if you can understand this, my brothers and sisters, then perhaps you can understand why climate change is such an important issue. Because this is not an irreversible issue. This is not an issue that is naturally occurring, but this is because our governments will not have the will or discipline to stand up to manufacturers and oil industries and say that the time for us depending upon oil as a primary means for transportation is long past, and we need to invest in finding alternatives because we are literally destroying our planet for our lack of discipline. That we can no longer afford to subsidize and support companies that are not responsible for the waste that they generate in the way that they poison our environment just because they aren't poisoning our neighborhood. Just because the poison happens in Witten Terrace and it doesn't happen in Avondale doesn't mean that we should turn a blind eye to it, my brothers and sisters. But the fact is that all of us have to inhabit this planet. And so we ought to think about and be responsible and hold our leaders responsible for what happens around climate change, my brothers and sisters. That what happens in the halls of government have an impact on the planet that we live in. And the same thing happened right here. Because of the injustice which caused the rain to stop, now the rivers have dried up and we are beginning to see an ecological disaster, and that disaster is impacting the prophet. But God, my brothers and sisters, God always has a plan B. There was a preacher by the name of Charles Booth not too long ago, transitioned from this life to eternity. Charles Booth was a pastor in Columbus, Ohio, and an early champion of social justice preaching before it became in vogue, my brothers and sisters. But Charles Voice, with his deep and booming voice, used to tell a story of an individual who went to an art gallery, and in this art gallery, he saw a painting, and the painting was entitled Checkmate. And in this painting, there was a man who was there, and he was playing chess with the devil. And the devil had his hand on a chess piece and was moving the chess piece into position to trap the king of the man. And the game was called Checkmate because it looked like the man who was playing against the devil was about to lose. And Charles Booth said the man would stare at this picture. He came to the art gallery and he stared at the picture from the time that the art gallery opened until the time that it closed. And just about the time it was about to close, the security guard came around and said, "Young man, it's time for you to go. We are about to close the art gallery for the day. You've got to come back another time." And as the security guard walked off, my brothers and sisters, that the young man shouted all of a sudden. He just let out a primal scream, and the security guard came running back and asked, "What is the matter? What's going on? What happened?" And the man grabbed the security guard and looked at him with the widest eyes possible and said, "It's a lie! It's a lie!" And he said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "The art picture, the picture, it's a lie." He said, "Young man, calm down. I need you to tell me what you mean. What are you saying it's a lie?" He said, "It's a lie." He said, "I play chess and I'm looking at this and the picture says checkmate, but it's a lie because the man has one more move." And Charles Booth would say that no matter where you are, no matter what situation you're in, when it looks like the devil has you in checkmate, I want you to know that God always has one more move for you. My brothers and sisters, so this is what we see in the widow of Zarephath, that God has a plan B for Elijah. That it looks like Elijah's only source of food has stopped, my brothers and sisters, and it looks like Elijah is going to succumb to the economic challenges that are brought about by the ecological disaster that has come because of the unjust practices of an empire that refuses to acknowledge the work and the will of God, my brothers and sisters. But when it looked like it was the last that the prophet was at his last move, God said, "I've got one more move for you. I want you to go to this town called Zarephath. And there is a widow in Zarephath, and I have instructed her to make sure that everything is going to be all right." Now, what you have to understand, my brothers and sisters, is that Zarephath is not a part of Israel. Zarephath is not a town that is under Israel's protection or rule. It is as if God sent Elijah to Haiti. Not to one of the 50 states, not even to Puerto Rico, which is a protectorate, even though we don't give them full rights, because if we made them the 51st state of the Union, we would create an imbalance in terms of the Senate, and then people are worried about political control, and so we dominate another country in a way that we did not want to be dominated when we were a colony, our brothers and sisters, because of how our fear of the political impact. But that's a different sermon for another day, our brothers and sisters. But God sent Elijah to their version of Haiti, to a poor region that is under-resourced, that has no connection to Israel legally, brothers and sisters. But what happens in Israel impacted what happened in Zarephath. Just the way that what happens in America impacts what happens in Haiti, brothers and sisters. Even though they are not one of our countries, even though our aid to them is limited, brothers and sisters, that we do far more for countries whose needs are far less than we do for Haiti that's in our own backyard, brothers and sisters. But God sends Elijah there to a widow in Haiti, in Zarephath, our brothers and sisters. And this is part of the amazing humanness of God, the way that God shows up, my brothers and sisters, because the first thing we see is that God is not just concerned about the people who claim to be God's people. That God is not just concerned about the people who are in Israel, my brothers and sisters, but that God sees that there is a Haitian widow who is in need, a widow from Zarephath who is in need, and God sends Elijah to that place so that Elijah and that woman can create a community so that everybody's needs can be met. And that's the way that God works, my brothers and sisters, that God doesn't just concern God's self with us because we gather here in the church to worship, that God is not just concerned about us because we claim to be Christians, my brothers and sisters, because we know the Lord's Prayer and can recite the 23rd Psalm and can sing at least one, if not two or three, or maybe all four, or the hidden fifth verse of Amazing Grace, my brothers and sisters. Not us because we know how to say a prayer that it sounds like we've been in church all of our lives, my brothers and sisters. God is not just concerned about us in this space, but God is concerned about the people who will never set their foot inside of a church house. That God's concern, my brothers and sisters, is universal. God loves the people outside of the church as much as God loves us, my brothers and sisters. And so I don't want us to stop shouting and singing and celebrating about God's love for us, because I'm so glad that God loved me. I'm so glad that God loved me before I knew how to love myself. I'm so glad that God's love for me did not give up when I felt like giving up, my brothers and sisters. I'm so glad about that. I don't want us to stop celebrating God's love for us. I just want us to remember that just as God loves us, God loves Pookie and Ray Ray and Little Man down the street in the same way that God loves us. And so God sends Elijah to this widow of Zarephath to go and says, I've already instructed her that you are on your way. And Elijah goes. He encounters this woman, and so they engage in conversation. And Elijah can't just say from the outset, God sent me to come to you. Elijah's got to do the masculine thing. He's got to invoke his toxic masculine privilege and give the woman orders. Go get me something to drink. And then while you're at it, give me some food too. It would have been just easier if he had said, look, God had a conversation with me. God told me that God had a conversation with you. And so can we figure out how we can work this out together so that everybody's needs get met? But no, he can't do that. Elijah can't do that. He's got to go and give the woman orders. But let us forgive Elijah for his humanness in this point. But he encounters this woman and asks for something to drink and then something to eat. And because this woman who has had a conversation with God, mind you that it's not that God does not rely on Elijah to tell the woman what to do, but God had already talked to the woman God's self, my brothers and sisters, which is part of the reason why I will always be an advocate for women preaching, my brothers and sisters, because to think that God can only speak to men and require men to speak to women is just, it's not biblical, my brothers and sisters. It's part of a system that we have been force-fed that is not true to the Bible or true to our own experience, my brothers and sisters, because the fact is, before any man taught me about the Bible, that it was Sister Carrie, who was a kindergarten teacher at Southern Baptist Church, who was the first person that told me that Jesus loved me, my brothers and sisters. Before I heard any man preach about it, it was the women who taught me in the Sunday school lessons, my brothers and sisters. And the fact that I'm able to stand up and preach is because women instructed me and helped and shaped and nurtured me, my brothers and sisters, which is why I'm so glad that we have Reverend Belinda Larkin, who is with us and a part of this church, my brothers and sisters, even though today she's worshiping with her son, because she wants to be with her family for Mother's Day, and that's all right. But I'm so glad to have her leadership, because we need to be reminded, my brothers and sisters, that God is able and willing to use people no matter what society prescribes or says their roles ought to be.
That's right.
Which is why, my brothers and sisters, I am going to always, which is why I'm going to be supporting and encouraging and rooting for and praying for Kamala Harris to be the next president of the United States until Stacey Abrams decides to run. And then I'm going to go for Stacey Abrams because that is my homegirl. Because, my brothers and sisters, I don't care, the notion that we need Joe Biden to beat Donald Trump is a foolish notion. We do not need to rely on old white men to save us from other old white men. But in our own community, in our own wisdom, we have people who have lived experiences that we have lived, who are capable of leading this nation, my brothers and sisters, and it doesn't need to just be a man. We can have women and we can have a black woman who is capable of running this country. God speaks to the widow, my brothers and sisters, before God speaks to Elijah. And then God tells Elijah what God has told this widow, so that by the time Elijah and the widow come together, they have both had conversations with God and understand the community that God is bringing them together to create. Our brothers and sisters, and it's a beautiful thing because when God brings them together, God creates a symbiotic community so that the widow is able to provide for the needs of Elijah, so Elijah can keep doing the prophet things that Elijah needs to do, but also that God is blessing the widow, so the widow is able to provide for herself and her family, so that their needs do not run out, so that in a time when an economy is being strained because of unjust practices by an empire that refuses to acknowledge God, God creates a haven, a protectorate, a house that is safe, my brothers and sisters, that does not run out. And when there was no Kroger to go shop at, my brothers and sisters, this house is continually stocked with food because God protects the house. Because God provided everything that they needed in this place, my brothers and sisters. God used the ingenious of creative community that does not look like what the world says community ought to look like, of an alternative structure in order to provide for the needs of this place so that God's work can continue and this woman's house can be taken care of. Because that is how God works. That God does not depend upon societal structures, my brothers and sisters. God does not depend on what everybody thinks things ought to look like, but God is able to create, to be creative, to create something out of nothing. Yes. God is able to take what looks like mismatched pieces and place them together to create something beautiful. Man. And even though the widow and Elijah did not know each other before this time, they come together to create a community which both are sustained. And so, my brothers and sisters, I would offer that we as a church, oftentimes we think of ourselves as being the place of refuge, of being the house of refuge, as being the place where people can come here to receive help, where people can come here to find safety, where people can come here to find peace, my brothers and sisters. But sometimes we have to admit that we are not the house of refuge, but sometimes we need to admit that we need to find refuge as well. Amen. That it's not just the community that needs to come here to find God, our brothers and sisters, but it's us that need to find the community, because God is not just located here at 710 North Fred Shuttlesworth Avenue, my brothers and sisters, but God is out in the community at work too. And sometimes God's best work does not happen here in the house on Sundays, but it happens out in Avondale, out in Witten Terrace, out in Roselawn, out in Bond Hill, out in the streets, my brothers and sisters, on days that are not just Sunday, but on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday. And if we just wait till Sunday at 11 o'clock to come to this place to see God work, then we're missing some of the best things that God can do, my brothers and sisters. But that the work of God is out in the community and it's happening through the week, my brothers and sisters. And so our call as the people of God is not just to be a place, to be a light on a hill that calls people to come to us, but we must be a place that goes out. Yes. Out into the community. Yes. Out into the places, to the Zarepheths of our land, of our region, out to the places where other people will not go, so that we can be together the community that God is calling for us to be. I want you to know that you are more than enough. I want you to know that you're not in this work alone. And I want you to know that God is calling us to be creative community with people, to see some of God's best handiwork done, to help meet our needs and the needs of others. We have a practice here at Beloved Community Church that we call response to the word. It's our way of acknowledging that God does not just desire to speak to and through me because I'm the one up here with the microphone, but that God desires to speak to and through each